Good evening and welcome back to Mythic Dreamscapes. Tonight we're journeying into the world of one of the most fascinating, cunning and delightfully chaotic figures in all of Greek mythology. As always, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Get comfortable, settle in with your favorite blanket, maybe light a candle or dim the lights, and let's begin our exploration of Hermes, the messenger god, the guide of souls, the patron of travelers, thieves, and trade. Among the 12 Olympians who ruled from the heights of Mount Olympus, few were as versatile, as quick-witted, or as universally needed as Hermes. He was the god who could be everywhere and nowhere, who moved between worlds with the ease of thought itself, who served as the divine intermediary between realms that should never touch. Where other gods claimed dominion over singular elements, earth or sea or sky, Hermes claimed the spaces in between, the thresholds, the crossroads, the boundaries themselves. He was, in essence, the god of transition, of movement, of that liminal space where one thing becomes another. But before he was any of those grand things, before he carried messages for Zeus or guided souls to the underworld, Hermes was a baby. And not just any baby, but quite possibly the most precocious, troublemaking, utterly brilliant infant in all of mythology. His story begins not with thunderbolts or great proclamations, but with a secret affair, a cave in the mountains, and a child born at dawn who would, by sunset, have already committed his first heist. The tale of Hermes begins, as so many divine stories do, with Zeus and his wandering eye. The king of the gods had many lovers, many affairs that incurred the volcanic wrath of his wife Hera. But this particular liaison was conducted with unusual discretion. Perhaps Zeus had learned something from his previous scandals, or perhaps the woman in question was simply very good at hiding. Her name was Maia, and she was one of the 7 Pleiades, daughters of the Titan Atlas, who himself held the weight of the heavens upon his shoulders as punishment for defying the Olympians. Maia was beautiful, yes, but more importantly, she was shy, reclusive, preferring solitude to the glittering chaos of divine society. She made her home in a deep cave on Mount Cyllene in Arcadia, a remote and wild region of Greece where mountains touched the sky and shepherds watched their flocks among ancient groves. It was there, in the dead of night when Hera lay bound in sweet sleep, that Zeus came to her. Night after night, in secrecy and shadow, their affair continued, and from that hidden union, a child was conceived. When the time came, Maia gave birth alone in her cave, as dawn painted the eastern sky with fingers of rose and gold. The baby arrived with the morning light, small and squirming, and already, somehow, grinning. His name was Hermes. The origins of this name stretch back into the mists of time, appearing in the earliest records we have of Greek civilization. In the ancient Mycenaean Greek found on Linear B tablets from the Bronze Age, tablets dating back to somewhere between the 15th and 13th centuries before the Common Era, his name appears as something like Hermahas, rendered in that syllabic script as Ima-A. These tablets, discovered at important sites like Pylos, Thebes, and Knossos, prove that Hermes was already a significant figure in the religious life of the earliest Greeks we can document. Most scholars believe the name derives from Herma, which means a heap of stones, the kind used as boundary markers along roads in the countryside. These stone cairns dotted the Greek landscape, marking paths, denoting borders between properties, guiding travelers through unfamiliar territory. Others suggest even older origins, perhaps from a pre-Greek language, or linked to an ancient root meaning to bind or put together. Some researchers point to possible connections with Proto-Indo-European pastoral gods, given Hermes' association with shepherds and flocks. Whatever its true etymology, the name fit, because Hermes would become the god of boundaries, the one who marked them, crossed them, and in many cases gleefully ignored them entirely. He would become the guardian of thresholds, the protector of those who traveled between spaces, the deity who understood that rules about where one thing ends and another begins are, at their core, negotiable. Maia wrapped her newborn son in swaddling clothes and laid him in his cradle, exhausted from the birth. She fell into a deep, well-earned sleep, and that, she assumed, would be that. A few hours of rest, then she would wake to feed and care for her infant. She had no idea what she was dealing with. By noon, Hermes was already bored. This was not a normal infant. This was a god, and gods, even newborn ones, develop rather differently than mortals. While human babies spend their first day crying and sleeping, and generally being helpless, divine babies tend to have other plans. Hermes wriggled out of his swaddling clothes with surprising ease. He looked around the cave, taking in the dim light filtering through the entrance, the rocky walls, the silence. Then, with the determination of someone who has places to be and things to steal, he crawled out of his cradle and toddled toward the cave mouth on legs that had never before borne weight. The world outside was vast and bright and utterly fascinating. Hermes stepped into the sunlight, stretched his little arms and grinned. The mountain air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and wild herbs. Birds sang in the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a stream burbled over stones. It was in short a perfect day to be alive and divine. Then he spotted something near the entrance. A tortoise, slow and peaceful, making its patient way across a rock, oblivious to the presence of a newborn god with ideas. Now most children, even divine ones, might have simply watched the tortoise, perhaps poked it gently, maybe tried to pick it up and see if it would retreat into its shell. Hermes, however, looked at that tortoise and saw potential. He saw an instrument. He saw music waiting to be born. He saw in that patient creature's shell the future of Greek culture. "Hello there, beautiful creature," he said, his voice surprisingly clear for a being only hours old. "What a lovely shell you have. I wonder if you'd mind terribly if I borrowed it." The tortoise, of course, did not answer. Tortoises rarely do. They have their own concerns, their own slow progress through the world, and they generally don't involve themselves in the schemes of gods. Hermes picked up the creature, examined it from all angles with the critical eye of an artist surveying raw materials, and then, with the kind of casual efficiency that would become his trademark, he killed it. Not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Because what Hermes needed wasn't the tortoise, it was the shell. He scooped out the flesh with his tiny fingers, cleaned the hollow dome with meticulous care, and then set about his next task. He needed strings for his instrument. The sources tell us he used gut strings, most likely from sheep, though the exact details vary in different tellings. Some later accounts suggest he slaughtered 2 of Apollo's cattle for this purpose, though that particular detail gets tangled with the later cattle theft. What matters is that he stretched these strings taut across the hollow shell and fashioned pegs to hold them in place. 7 strings stretched over a tortoise shell, 7 notes that would become the foundation of Greek music. Some later writers suggested these 7 strings honored the 7 Pleiades, his mother's sisters who danced in the night sky, though this connection appears in later interpretations rather than the earliest sources. The Homeric hymn to Hermes, one of our oldest and most detailed accounts of this story, doesn't mention this symbolism, focusing instead on the practical brilliance of the invention itself. And just like that, the lyre was born. The first stringed instrument in all of creation, invented by a baby god before lunchtime on his first day of life. Hermes plucked the strings experimentally. The sound was extraordinary, pure and resonant, like the voice of the mountain itself given form. Each string sang out with a different tone, and together they created harmonies that had never before existed in the world. He played a little tune, a hymn celebrating his own birth, improvising with the confidence of someone who has never been told they can't do something. The cave behind him resonated with the sound, amplifying it, sending it echoing across the mountainside. Birds fell silent to listen. The wind itself seemed to pause. It was beautiful. It was perfect. And Hermes even then knew exactly what it was worth. He knew that he had created something that would change the world, something that would bring joy and sorrow, celebration and lamentation, would accompany warriors to battle and lovers to trysts, would outlast empires and civilizations. But he wasn't finished. Not nearly. Because now that he had created something wonderful, he was starting to feel rather hungry. And Hermes, being Hermes, decided that what he needed was meat. Fresh meat. The kind you get from cattle. Specifically, Apollo's cattle. As the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the Greek landscape, Hermes set out on his first great adventure. He didn't know yet that he was stealing from his half-brother, one of the most powerful gods on Olympus, the radiant god of the sun, music, prophecy, and about a dozen other impressive domains. All Hermes knew was that there were cattle grazing in the shadowy mountains of Pieria in Thessaly, and that nobody seemed to be watching them very closely. Perfect. The distance from Mount Cyllene in Arcadia to Pieria in Thessaly was substantial, several days' journey for a mortal traveler. Hermes made it in hours. He flew across the landscape with supernatural speed, his infant legs carrying him vast distances in impossibly short time, as though space itself bent to accommodate his will. The sources place Apollo's cattle in Pieria, a region associated with both Macedonia and Thessaly in ancient geography, a place sacred to the muses who inspired all artistic endeavor. When he reached the pastures where Apollo kept his sacred herd, Hermes surveyed the situation with the eye of a master thief. 50 head of cattle, all beautiful, all valuable, all just standing there in the twilight, chewing their cud and looking profoundly unbothered by the world's concerns. They were magnificent beasts, sleek and healthy, the kind of cattle that spoke to divine ownership and care. But Hermes was clever. Even at just hours old, he understood that simply driving the cattle away would leave an obvious trail, one that even the dimmest shepherd could follow. So he implemented several cunning strategies that would become legendary in their own right, strategies that would be studied and admired by thieves and tricksters for millennia to come. First, he fashioned crude sandals out of twigs and bark, weaving them together with the skill of an experienced craftsman, despite never having done such a thing before. He tied these to his own feet, obscuring his footprints. Different accounts describe different methods, some saying he tied oak and myrtle branches to his feet, others mentioning different types of wood. The details vary, but the principle remains. He made it impossible to track him by his footprints. Then, and this was the truly brilliant part, he drove the cattle backward. He forced them to walk in reverse so that their hoof prints pointed in the wrong direction, suggesting they had wandered off toward the mountain when in fact he was driving them away from it. Anyone following the trail would be led in precisely the opposite direction of where the cattle had actually gone. As he passed through a small village in the night, an old man named Battus spotted him. The farmer, working his land in the fading light, called out to the strange child driving the cattle in such an unusual manner. "Where are you taking those animals, boy?" Hermes, thinking quickly, smiled his most innocent smile, the smile of a baby who couldn't possibly be doing anything wrong. "Oh, just taking them home. But if anyone asks, you didn't see me. And if you keep this secret, I'll make sure you have a very good harvest this year." Battus, perhaps sensing something otherworldly about this infant cattle rustler, perhaps simply wanting a good harvest, agreed readily enough. He nodded and returned to his work, and Hermes continued on his way, driving the stolen herd toward a cave near the river Alpheos in the Peloponnese, far from where Apollo kept them. But Hermes, being Hermes, decided to test the old man's integrity. He disguised himself and returned shortly after, approaching Battus once more. "Excuse me, good fellow," Hermes said in a different voice. "I'm looking for some cattle that went missing. Fine beasts, 50 of them. Have you seen anyone pass by with such animals?" The old man hesitated. Then his eyes lit up with recognition, not of Hermes' identity, but of opportunity. "Well, now that you mention it, I might have seen something, but my memory is a bit fuzzy. Perhaps a small reward would help me recall the details." Hermes' eyes narrowed. So much for keeping secrets. Without a word, he struck Battus with his new staff, turning the oath-breaker to stone where he stood. The punishment was harsh, but the message was clear. When Hermes asked for discretion, he expected it. When he reached the hidden cave near the river, Hermes slaughtered 2 of the cattle. He rubbed 2 sticks together in a particular way, another invention, creating fire for what may have been one of the first times in the mortal world, or at least one of the first times anyone had created it through friction, rather than stealing it from another source. The technique was so novel that it would become associated with Hermes as one of his many gifts to humanity. He roasted the meat and prepared it as a sacrifice to the gods, dividing it into 12 portions, honoring all 12 Olympians, including himself, which was either remarkably forward-thinking or simply audacious. Here was a day-old god who hadn't yet been formally recognized, already counting himself among the great powers of Olympus, and expecting offerings in his honor. What's particularly interesting is that despite being hungry, despite having killed the cattle specifically for meat, Hermes didn't eat any of it. Various sources interpret this differently. Some suggest it was because he was honoring the ancient Greek tradition of sacrifice, where the gods received the aroma and essence of the burned offerings while the meat went to the worshippers. Others propose that Hermes was making a statement about his divine nature, proving that he needed no mortal sustenance. Still others think he was simply being clever, ensuring that he left no physical evidence of consumption. After the sacrifice, he drove the remaining 48 cattle into the cave and covered the entrance with brush and branches, concealing them from sight. Then he walked back to Mount Cyllene, backward himself this time, confusing the trail even further. By the time he arrived at his mother's cave, dawn was breaking again. Hermes slipped back into his swaddling clothes, arranged himself in the cradle, and lay there looking for all the world like an innocent newborn who had never left his bed. Maya woke a short time later, stretched, and looked over at her peacefully sleeping child. Everything seemed perfectly normal. She had no idea that her baby had, in a single day, invented the lyre, created fire, stolen Apollo's cattle, performed the first sacrifice, and established himself as the patron of thieves everywhere. Apollo noticed his cattle were missing almost immediately. The god of prophecy, the far-seeing one who missed very little, discovered the theft and was absolutely furious. These were his sacred cattle, tended with care, part of his divine possessions. The theft was not just a crime, but an insult to his dignity and power. He followed the trail, confused by the backward hoofprints, baffled by the strange tracks that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere at once. He questioned shepherds and farmers, pieced together clues, and eventually his divine senses led him to Mount Cyllene and to the cave where Maya lived with her newborn son. Apollo burst into the cave with the righteous anger of a god who has been wronged. "Your child has stolen my cattle," he declared, his voice echoing off the stone walls. Maya looked at him with genuine confusion. "My child?" She gestured to the cradle where Hermes lay swaddled, looking up at them with wide, innocent eyes. "He's only a day old. He can't even walk. How could he possibly steal cattle?" "I know what I know," Apollo insisted. "The trail leads here. Your son is the thief." Hermes, still wrapped in his swaddling clothes, spoke up. "I don't even know what cattle are. I've been right here in my cradle the entire time. Look at me. Do I look like a cattle rustler?" The argument escalated. Apollo was certain. Maya was adamant that her newborn couldn't possibly have done such a thing, and Hermes maintained his innocence with the confidence of someone who knew he wouldn't be held accountable even if caught. Finally, Zeus intervened. The king of the gods, amused by the entire situation, called both his sons before him. The accounts differ on exactly how this played out, whether it happened on Olympus or at Maya's cave, but the confrontation between the infant god and his radiant half-brother became one of the most famous scenes in Greek mythology. Zeus looked at the tiny Hermes and the furious Apollo and suppressed a smile. "Well, Hermes, did you steal your brother's cattle?" Hermes looked up at his father with the innocent expression perfected by children throughout history when caught red-handed. "Father, I swear by the river Styx," and here he paused dramatically. Knowing that an oath by the Styx was the most binding of all divine oaths, "I did not drive his cattle home. How could I? I don't even know what a cow looks like." The audience watching this exchange, both divine and mortal in the retelling, would have caught the precise wording. Hermes didn't drive the cattle home. He drove them to a cave. He was technically telling the truth while lying through his teeth. It was a masterclass in the art of deception, the kind of wordplay that would become his trademark. Zeus, who had witnessed the entire theft through his omniscient gaze, was delighted by his son's cleverness. But Apollo was not amused. He demanded the cattle be returned. He demanded punishment for the theft. He demanded recognition of the crime. It was at this moment that Hermes produced the lyre. "Brother," he said sweetly, "I did make something yesterday. Perhaps you'd like to see it." And he began to play. The music that poured forth from that tortoise shell was unlike anything Apollo had ever heard. Despite being the god of music himself, despite his mastery of numerous instruments, Apollo had never encountered sounds quite like these. The lyre's voice was clear and pure, capable of expressing joy and sorrow, celebration and lamentation, all the emotions that music could contain. Apollo was instantly, completely entranced. What is that?" he breathed, stepping closer, all anger forgotten. "It's a lyre," Hermes explained. "I invented it yesterday. I'd be happy to teach you how to play it." And here's where the story reveals Hermes's true genius. He offered Apollo a trade, the lyre in exchange for the cattle. More than that, he offered Apollo something new, something innovative, something that would expand the god of music's own domain and delight. Apollo, who could appreciate artistry and innovation when he saw it, agreed. Not only did he agree to let Hermes keep the cattle, but he also gave Hermes his blessing and, in some versions, his golden staff, which would become the caduceus. The two brothers, who had begun their relationship with theft and accusation, became close friends and allies. The Homeric hymn to Hermes, our most detailed ancient source for this story, emphasizes this reconciliation. Apollo recognizes Hermes' gifts and talents. He sees that his infant brother is no ordinary god, that he possesses cleverness and creativity that complement Apollo's own talents. Where Apollo represents divine order, music, and prophecy, Hermes represents the unexpected, the clever solution, the boundaries crossed. Zeus, watching this resolution, formally acknowledged Hermes as one of the Olympians. He assigned the infant god his roles and responsibilities: messenger of the gods, patron of travelers and merchants, protector of boundaries, and yes, patron of thieves as well. It was official. The baby who had stolen cattle on his first day of life was now a recognized member of the divine family. But there was one more exchange between the brothers that day. Hermes, never one to leave well enough alone, produced another instrument he'd invented, the syrinx, or panpipes, fashioned from reeds of different lengths. The sound was different from the lyre, more rustic, more wild, but equally beautiful. Apollo wanted this too, and so they traded again. Apollo gave Hermes a golden staff that would become the caduceus, the symbol of the herald and messenger. In some versions, Apollo also taught Hermes the art of prophecy, though in a limited form. Hermes would never have Apollo's gift for grand prophecy, but he would learn the practice of divination through pebbles, a more practical, earthbound form of seeing the future. With his position on Olympus secured, and his relationships with his divine siblings established, Hermes took up his primary role as the messenger of the gods. This wasn't simply a matter of carrying notes between deities. In the ancient Greek understanding, a herald or messenger was a sacred position, protected by divine law and custom. In the mortal world, heralds were inviolate. They could travel between warring cities, between enemies who would otherwise kill each other on sight, and they were guaranteed safe passage. They wore specific clothing and carried staffs that marked their status. To harm a herald was not just a crime, but a sacrilege, an offense against the gods themselves. The institution of the herald was fundamental to Greek civilization, making communication and diplomacy possible even in times of conflict. Hermes, as the divine herald, embodied and protected this institution. His staff, the caduceus, became the symbol of all heralds and messengers. In its earliest forms, the caduceus was simply a staff or wand, sometimes depicted as a branch with shoots or ribbons. Later, it evolved into the familiar form we recognize today, a staff entwined with two serpents, sometimes topped with wings. The origin of the serpents on the caduceus has several explanations in mythology. One story tells that Hermes encountered two snakes fighting and placed his staff between them, causing them to wind around it and cease their conflict. Thus, the caduceus became a symbol of peace and negotiation, as well as communication. The snakes themselves, in ancient Greek symbolism, represented wisdom, rebirth, and the connection between the earthly and divine realms, as serpents were chthonic creatures, associated with the underworld and the earth itself. As Zeus's messenger, Hermes was constantly busy. He carried divine commands from Olympus to the mortal world and back again. He delivered Zeus's judgments, conveyed his orders, sometimes even carried out tasks that Zeus couldn't or wouldn't do himself. This made Hermes one of the most universally present gods in Greek mythology. He appears in more myths and stories than almost any other Olympian, always showing up at crucial moments to deliver messages, provide assistance, or move the plot forward. His role required speed, which he possessed in abundance. The winged sandals, the talaria, allowed him to move with incredible swiftness, flying through the air as easily as walking on the ground. These sandals were described as golden, beautiful, immortal, made with sublime artistry. In the earliest depictions, the wings spring directly from the sandals themselves. Later, artistic representations sometimes show wings on his ankles, and later still, wings on a cap or helmet as well. But speed wasn't enough. A good messenger also needed eloquence, the ability to deliver messages clearly and persuasively. Hermes was renowned for his silver tongue, his facility with words, his ability to convince and cajole. The Greeks considered him a god of rhetoric and language itself. Some traditions even credited him with the invention of the alphabet, though this invention is also attributed to other figures in different myths. His eloquence wasn't just about pretty words. It was about understanding his audience, reading situations, knowing when to be formal and when to be casual, when to be threatening and when to be charming. He was a diplomat as much as a messenger, someone who could smooth over conflicts, negotiate between opposing parties, find common ground where none seemed to exist. The nature of his work also required discretion. Hermes became a keeper of secrets, a god who knew more than he told, who understood that information was power, and that sometimes the greatest service was knowing when to remain silent. Zeus trusted him with sensitive missions precisely because Hermes understood the importance of confidentiality. One of the most famous examples of Hermes' work as a messenger appears in Homer's Odyssey. When the hero Odysseus is trapped on the island of the nymph Calypso, held captive by her love for him, Zeus decides that enough is enough. Odysseus has suffered long enough and it's time for him to go home. But Zeus can't simply show up on Calypso's island and make demands. That's not how it works. Instead, he sends Hermes. Hermes flies across the sea to the island, which is described as so remote that even gods rarely visit it. He finds Calypso in her beautiful cave, singing and weaving, and delivers Zeus's command. She must let Odysseus go. Calypso is furious. She argues that the male gods are hypocrites, taking mortal lovers themselves, but forcing goddesses to give up the men they love. It's one of the most pointed criticisms of divine double standards in all of Greek literature. But Hermes, with his characteristic eloquence and diplomacy, persuades her. He reminds her that defying Zeus is unwise, that Odysseus is fated to return home, that she cannot fight destiny itself. He's gentle but firm, sympathetic but unyielding, and Calypso, though heartbroken, agrees. She lets Odysseus go. Later in the same epic, Hermes appears again to help Odysseus. When the hero's men are turned into pigs by the sorceress Circe, Hermes meets Odysseus on his way to her palace and gives him a magical herb called moly. This plant will protect him from Circe's magic, allowing him to resist her spells and free his men. Hermes doesn't just hand over the herb and leave. He instructs Odysseus on exactly how to use it, what to do when he confronts Circe, how to negotiate with her. This pattern repeats throughout Greek mythology. Hermes shows up at crucial moments, provides the tools or information needed, offers guidance, and then steps back, allowing mortals and heroes to complete their tasks. He's a helper, but not one who does everything for you. He gives you what you need to succeed, but you still have to do the work. While Hermes' role as messenger might be his most visible function, perhaps his most profound duty was that of psychopomp, the guide of souls to the underworld. The Greek word psychopomp literally means soul guide or soul conductor, and Hermes was the primary psychopomp of Greek religion. When someone died, their soul, the psyche, needed to make the journey from the world of the living to Hades, the realm of the dead. This wasn't automatic. The soul couldn't simply arrive there. It needed guidance, protection, safe conduct through the dangerous transition between life and death. This was Hermes' job. He would appear at the moment of death or shortly after, gentle and calming, and escort the soul on its journey. He led them to the river Styx, the boundary between the living world and the realm of the dead. There, the soul would board Charon's ferry for the final crossing. Hermes' presence ensured that no soul got lost, that none were left wandering in the in-between spaces, confused and alone. This role makes Hermes one of the few gods who could freely travel between all three realms: Olympus, the mortal world, and the underworld. Hades himself ruled the underworld, and Persephone shared that rule for part of each year, but they didn't leave. Hermes moved between all three, a unique position that emphasized his nature as a god of transitions and boundaries. The ancient Greeks depicted this role in their art and poetry. Gravestones often featured images of Hermes, showing him gently leading souls by the hand. The scenes are typically peaceful, not frightening. Hermes appears calm and kind, a guide rather than a jailer, helping rather than forcing. The message was clear: death was a journey, and Hermes would make sure you didn't make it alone. This psychopomp function deeply influenced how Greeks thought about death. Because Hermes was the guide, death became less about punishment or reward in the early Greek understanding and more about transition. You were changing states, moving from one form of existence to another, and Hermes would help you make that change safely. In Homer's Odyssey, there's a beautiful passage at the end where Hermes leads the souls of the dead suitors, the men killed by Odysseus, down to the underworld. Homer describes Hermes holding his golden staff, using it to wake or lull mortals as he wished, leading the gibbering souls like a flock. They follow him down dark and dank paths, past the streams of ocean, past the white rock and the gates of the sun, down to the meadow of asphodel, where the souls of the dead dwell. The image is both eerie and comforting. Hermes is described as the helper, and despite the soul's fear and confusion, his presence provides structure and direction. Even in death, even in the unknown, there is order and guidance. This role also connected Hermes to dreams, which the Greeks understood as experiences at the boundary between waking and sleeping, between consciousness and unconsciousness. Hermes could send dreams to mortals, visiting them in the night with messages or visions. Some Greeks would pray to Hermes before sleep, offering him the last libation of the evening, asking for peaceful rest or meaningful dreams. The association with dreams, with sleep, with the boundary between conscious and unconscious, all fit perfectly with Hermes' role as the god of transitions. He existed wherever one state changed to another, and the Greeks recognized that there were many such transitions beyond just physical movement from place to place. Physical boundaries were equally important to Hermes' identity. In ancient Greece, the countryside was marked by hermes, which were basically pillars or heaps of stones that marked boundaries, crossroads, and important locations. The earliest hermes were simple, just piles of rocks. Travelers would add a stone to the pile as they passed, building up these markers over time. The practice was both practical, marking the way, and religious, honoring Hermes. Later, hermes became more elaborate. They evolved into rectangular pillars with a bust of Hermes at the top, and traditionally, a phallus carved on the front. The phallus wasn't just about sexuality in the crude modern sense. In ancient Greek religion, it represented fertility, generative power, the life force itself. Hermes, as a boundary god, protected the fertility of the land and the people who lived there. These hermes stood at crossroads, in front of houses at the edges of towns, marking thresholds of all kinds. To damage a herm was a serious crime, both legally and religiously. In 415 BCE, Athens was rocked by a scandal when many of the city's herms were vandalized overnight. The incident caused a massive investigation, accusations flew, and the general Alcibiades was even forced into exile over suspicions he was involved, though his guilt was never proven. The Athenians' horror at this vandalism shows how seriously they took the sanctity of these boundary markers. As the god of boundaries, Hermes naturally became the patron of travelers. Anyone crossing from one place to another, from home to foreign land, from city to wilderness, was under Hermes' protection. Travelers would pray to him before setting out on journeys, asking for safe passage. They would make offerings at Hermes along the road, ensuring his continued favor. This protection extended to specific categories of travelers. Merchants, for instance, traveling to distant markets with valuable goods, relied heavily on Hermes. He became known as the god of commerce and trade, not just because he protected travelers, but because trade itself is about exchange, about crossing boundaries between different economic spheres, different communities, different ways of valuing things. The connection to commerce also made Hermes the god of weights and measures, the standards by which goods were traded. Fair dealing in the marketplace required accurate measurement, and Hermes oversaw this. Merchants would swear oaths by Hermes, binding themselves to honest practice. Of course, Hermes was also the patron of dishonest merchants and thieves, which tells us something interesting about how the Greeks understood commerce. There was always an element of trickery to trade, a sense that cleverness and cunning were as much part of the process as honest dealing. Thieves naturally claimed Hermes as their patron after his famous cattle theft on his first day of life. He understood what it meant to take what wasn't yours, to move through the world unseen, to cleverly evade detection and punishment. But interestingly, Hermes wasn't just about taking things, he was also about returning them, about redistribution. He put stolen goods back into circulation. In some ways, Hermes represented the flow of wealth and goods through society, the constant movement and exchange that kept communities alive. His protection of travelers also extended to the specific challenge of finding one's way. Hermes was invoked by people who were lost, who needed guidance, who stood at literal or metaphorical crossroads, unsure which path to take. The crossroads itself was sacred to Hermes. Standing at the intersection of different paths, different possibilities, different futures, you were in Hermes's domain. People would leave offerings at crossroads, asking for his guidance in choosing the right direction. This makes Hermes remarkably relevant to the human experience. How often do we stand at crossroads, uncertain which way to go? How often do we need guidance through transitions, through changes, through the boundaries between what was and what will be? Hermes understood these moments, he lived in them, and he offered help to those who asked. Throughout Greek mythology, Hermes appears repeatedly as a helper of heroes. He doesn't swoop in and solve all their problems for them, but he provides crucial assistance at key moments, often making the difference between success and failure, life and death. One of the most famous examples is his aid to Perseus on the hero's quest to kill Medusa. Perseus had been sent on what seemed like an impossible mission: bring back the head of one of the three Gorgons, creatures so hideous that anyone who looked at them turned instantly to stone. How do you kill something you can't look at? Hermes appeared to Perseus with both gifts and guidance. He gave or helped Perseus obtain several crucial items: winged sandals like Hermes's own, allowing Perseus to fly; a special bag, the caduceus, which would contain Medusa's head safely after it was severed, and according to some versions, the harpy, a curved sword or sickle capable of cutting through Medusa's scales. More importantly, Hermes led Perseus to the Graea, the Grey sisters who shared a single eye and a single tooth among them. These sisters knew the location of certain nymphs who possessed other items Perseus would need, including Hades' helmet of invisibility. Hermes taught Perseus how to steal the Graea's eye, forcing them to reveal the information he needed. Throughout Perseus's adventure, Hermes appeared at crucial moments. He helped Perseus find the Gorgon's lair. Some sources say he even stood by Perseus as the hero approached Medusa, helping him use his polished shield as a mirror so he could see Medusa's reflection without looking directly at her. After Perseus succeeded and cut off Medusa's head, Hermes helped him escape from her sisters, who pursued him in rage. This pattern of assistance illustrates something important about Hermes's character. He helps, but he doesn't do everything. Perseus still had to face Medusa himself, had to strike the blow, had to deal with the consequences. Hermes provided the tools and guidance, but the hero still had to be heroic. It's a kind of divine mentorship, teaching by providing what's needed rather than simply solving the problem. During the Trojan War, Hermes played several crucial roles. One of the most moving scenes in Homer's Iliad involves Hermes guiding the aged king Priam of Troy through the Greek camp to Achilles' tent. Priam's son, Hector, had been killed by Achilles, who dragged Hector's body behind his chariot and refused to return it for proper burial, an outrage in Greek cultural terms. Priam, despite being old and at grave personal risk, decided to go to Achilles himself to ransom his son's body. This required traveling through the Greek camp, through an army that had been besieging his city for 10 years, to plead with the very man who had killed his son. It was an act of extraordinary courage and desperation. Hermes appeared to Priam in disguise, pretending to be a servant of Achilles, and guided the old king safely through the camp. He led him past sentries, through dangerous passages, directly to Achilles' tent. When they arrived, Hermes revealed his true identity, encouraged Priam, and then vanished, leaving the two enemies, the old father and the young warrior, to confront each other and find a moment of shared humanity in the midst of war. It's one of the most beautiful scenes in all of Greek literature, and Hermes makes it possible. He crosses boundaries here too, not geographical ones, but emotional and social ones, helping two enemies speak to each other as human beings, helping grief be acknowledged and honored even in the context of war. Hermes also helped Odysseus multiple times during his long journey home, as we've already mentioned. He freed him from Calypso's island, protected him from Circe's magic, and at the end of the Odyssey, Hermes gently guided the souls of the dead suitors to the underworld. Throughout Odysseus's adventures, Hermes appeared when needed most, providing exactly the right kind of help at the right time. Even Heracles, the greatest of Greek heroes, received assistance from Hermes. When Heracles needed to capture Cerberus, the three-headed dog who guarded the gates of the underworld, as one of his 12 labors, Hermes guided him into Hades' realm. The journey into the underworld was dangerous for mortals, even one as powerful as Heracles, and Hermes' guidance was essential. This repeated pattern of helping heroes teaches us something about how the Greeks understood divine assistance. The gods didn't make life easy. They didn't remove all obstacles or solve all problems, but they provided help, guidance, tools, and opportunities. Success still required human courage, cleverness, and effort. The partnership between human and divine was exactly that. A partnership, not a one-sided transaction. Despite his busy schedule carrying messages and guiding souls, Hermes still found time for romantic relationships and fathered numerous children, both divine and mortal. Though he never married formally in the myths, he had relationships with various goddesses, nymphs, and mortal women. His most famous divine child was Pan, the goat-footed god of shepherds, wild places, and rustic music. The identity of Pan's mother varies in different sources. Some say it was the nymph Dryope, others name Penelope, though probably not the famous wife of Odysseus, despite what some sources claim, and still others suggest different nymphs. What's consistent is that Pan inherited his father's love of music, inventing the panpipes or syrinx, though where Hermes' music was sophisticated and courtly, Pan's was wild and rustic, reflecting his nature. Pan became closely associated with his father, and together they watched over shepherds and their flocks. Pan's appearance was startling, half man and half goat, with horns and hooves. His very presence could cause panic, a word that derives from his name, when he appeared suddenly in lonely places. But he was also beloved by rural folk, who saw him as a protector of their livelihood. Another famous child was Hermaphroditus, born from Hermes' union with Aphrodite. The story of Hermaphroditus is both strange and touching. Born a beautiful boy, Hermaphroditus caught the attention of the Naiad Salmacis, who fell desperately in love with him. When he rejected her advances and went swimming in her pool, she embraced him and prayed to the gods that they might never be separated. The gods granted her wish, merging their two bodies into one being with both male and female characteristics. Hermaphroditus then prayed that anyone else who bathed in that pool would experience the same transformation, and this wish too was granted. The story reflects ancient Greek thinking about gender and identity in ways that continue to resonate. Hermaphroditus gave us the term hermaphrodite, though modern medical terminology has moved away from this word in favor of more precise and respectful terms like intersex. Among Hermes' mortal children, Autolycus stands out. Autolycus inherited his father's talents for thievery and was renowned as the Prince of Thieves. He had the ability to make stolen objects invisible or to change their appearance, making him impossible to catch. His daughter Anticlea became the mother of Odysseus, making Hermes the great-grandfather of one of Greek mythology's greatest heroes. This genealogy explains some of Odysseus's own characteristics: his cleverness, his skill at deception, his way with words, all traits inherited through this divine lineage. Other children included Euderus, one of the leaders of the Myrmidons during the Trojan War, Aethalides, the herald of the Argonauts on their quest for the Golden Fleece, and various other heroes and minor gods. Hermes' bloodline spread throughout Greek mythology, influencing numerous stories and heroes. Hermes also had close relationships with his fellow Olympians beyond his immediate family. His friendship with Apollo, which began so dramatically with the cattle theft, remained strong throughout their myths. The two gods often appeared together, their contrasting natures. Apollo's order and light versus Hermes' trickery and twilight, complementing each other perfectly. With Athena, Hermes shared a mutual respect based on their shared appreciation for cleverness and strategy. They worked together on several occasions, most notably in helping Perseus on his quest. Where Athena provided wisdom and strategic thinking, Hermes provided practical assistance and street smarts. His relationship with his half-brother Ares was more complicated. Hermes once had to rescue Ares from imprisonment by the twin giants Otus and Ephialtes, who had trapped the god of war in a bronze jar. The rescue showcased Hermes' cleverness and speed, as he had to sneak into the giant's stronghold and free Ares without being caught himself. With Hera, Hermes had a careful relationship. As the son of one of Zeus' many lovers, Hermes could have been a target for Hera's legendary jealousy. But Hermes was valuable to Hera as a messenger, and his generally helpful nature toward all the Olympians seems to have protected him from her wrath. There's even a story where Hermes helped Hera by slaying Argus, the hundred-eyed giant she had set to watch over Io. Though this seems contradictory, since Hermes was helping Zeus's interests by freeing Io, the story shows the complex web of divine relationships and obligations. Beyond the caduceus and the winged sandals we've already discussed, Hermes was associated with numerous other symbols and sacred objects that reveal different aspects of his character and domains. The precocious, a broad-brimmed traveler's hat, became one of his distinctive attributes. In artistic depictions, Hermes often wears this hat, sometimes with wings attached, sometimes without. The hat marked him as a traveler, someone always on the road, always moving between places. It was practical headgear for long journeys, providing protection from sun and rain, but it also symbolized the freedom of the road, the independence of the traveler who owed no allegiance to any single place. The rooster was sacred to Hermes, symbolizing the break of dawn, the herald of the new day. Since Hermes was himself a herald, this connection made sense. Roosters were also associated with alertness and watchfulness, qualities a good messenger needed. In some contexts, the rooster represented the announcement of important news, of changes coming, of transitions between night and day. The tortoise, naturally, held special significance as the creature whose shell became the first lyre. Images of tortoises appeared in Hermes' iconography, reminding viewers of his inventive nature and his gift of music to the world. Hermes was also associated with rams and goats, reflecting his early origins as a pastoral deity. Before he became the sophisticated messenger of the Olympians, Hermes was worshipped by shepherds and farmers, people who relied on the fertility of their flocks and the success of their herds. This aspect never entirely disappeared, and Hermes continued to protect shepherds throughout Greek history. Interestingly, fish and fishing were also sometimes connected to Hermes, though this association is less well documented than his others. The connection likely comes from his role as protector of the sea trade and fishermen, who certainly qualified as travelers in need of divine protection. The number 4 was considered sacred to Hermes. The 4th day of each month was his day, when festivals might be held in his honor. Various explanations exist for this association. Some connect it to the 4 directions, the 4 winds, the 4 corners of the earth, all relating to travel and movement. Others suggest numerological reasons that are less clear to us now. Certain plants were also sacred to Hermes. The crocus flower, with its vibrant color emerging from the earth in early spring, symbolized the crossing of the boundary between winter and spring, between dormancy and life. The strawberry tree, with its distinctive red fruit, was also associated with him, though the exact reasoning for this connection is less clear in the surviving sources. In terms of sacred places, Mount Cyllene in Arcadia, his birthplace, remained important throughout Greek history. A temple was built there, traditionally said to have been founded by Lycaon. From Arcadia, Hermes worship spread throughout Greece, with temples and sanctuaries established in many cities. However, interestingly, there were relatively few major temples dedicated solely to Hermes compared to other Olympians. This might be because Hermes was everywhere. The Herms themselves served as small shrines, ubiquitous throughout the Greek world, so elaborate temples were perhaps less necessary. Athens had several areas sacred to Hermes, particularly connected to the gymnasium and the agora, the marketplace. The association with gymnasiums developed later in Greek history, as Hermes became seen as a patron of athletics and the ideal of the beautifully trained body and mind. Young men training in the gymnasium would have been surrounded by Herms and images of Hermes, reminding them of the divine ideal they were working toward. The worship of Hermes took many forms throughout the ancient Greek world. At the most basic level, travelers and merchants would make small offerings at Hermes, leaving coins, food, or libations as they passed. These were quick, practical acts of devotion, asking for continued protection and favor. More formally, temples to Hermes hosted regular rituals and sacrifices. The animals sacrificed to Hermes were typically lambs, young goats, or pigs, reflecting his pastoral associations. Honey cakes were also common offerings, as were libations of wine or milk. The sacrifices weren't as elaborate as those offered to major gods like Zeus or Apollo, but they were sincere and frequent. The Hermaea was a festival celebrated in various Greek cities in honor of Hermes. The details varied by location, but generally the festival involved athletic competitions, particularly running races, which made sense given Hermes' legendary speed. There might also be musical competitions, again honoring Hermes as the inventor of the lyre. Young men would participate in these contests, demonstrating their speed, skill, and strength, qualities associated with Hermes and valued by Greek society. In some locations, the Hermaea included a peculiar ritual where participants would smear themselves with oil and then engage in a kind of wrestling or grappling. The oil made it difficult to maintain a hold, requiring cleverness and quick thinking rather than just brute strength, qualities associated with Hermes rather than Ares or Heracles. At Pellene in Achaea, there was a famous statue of Hermes Dolios, Hermes the Crafty, and an ancient foot race was held in his honor. The race's antiquity suggests it predated many other Greek athletic competitions, possibly going back to very early forms of Hermes worship. In Boeotia, an interesting festival remembered how Hermes saved the city from a plague. The god carried a ram around the city walls, and the plague ended. To commemorate this, during the annual festival, the most handsome young man in the city would carry a lamb around the walls, reenacting Hermes' protective act. It's a charming example of how mythology and religious practice intertwined, how stories about the gods became templates for ritual action. The practice of leaving offerings at crossroads was widespread and particularly associated with Hermes, though also with Hecate, who shared some of his liminal qualities. People would leave food, coins, or other gifts at crossroads, particularly at night, asking for guidance or protection. These offerings acknowledged that crossroads were sacred, dangerous, and powerful spaces where different paths, different possibilities, different fates intersected. Before sleep, Greeks might offer Hermes the last libation of the evening, asking for peaceful rest and good dreams. This nighttime devotion recognized Hermes' role at the boundary between waking and sleeping, between consciousness and the dream world. In a darker aspect of his worship, Hermes was sometimes invoked in curse tablets, thin sheets of lead inscribed with curses or binding spells. These tablets were buried or thrown into wells, asking divine powers to harm enemies or prevent rivals from succeeding. Hermes appeared in some of these curses, particularly those related to competition, commerce, or theft. This reminds us that ancient Greek religion wasn't all noble philosophy and beautiful temples. It also included practical magic, petitions for advantage, and appeals to the gods' more ruthless aspects. As Greek culture spread through conquest and trade, Hermes worship spread with it. The Romans, as they adopted Greek religious practices, identified Hermes with their own god Mercury. The identification was so complete that Mercury essentially replaced whatever earlier Roman deity might have filled similar roles. Mercury in Roman religion retained all of Hermes' major characteristics: messenger of the gods, patron of merchants and travelers, trickster figure, guide of souls. The Romans built temples to Mercury throughout their empire, and his worship became one of the most widespread in the Roman world. The planet closest to the sun was named Mercury because of its swift movement across the sky, just as Hermes was the swiftest of the gods. Interestingly, as the Roman Empire expanded, Mercury became syncretized with various local gods in the provinces. Celtic peoples identified Mercury with their god Lugus, creating a combined Mercurius-Lugus figure. Germanic peoples associated Mercury with Odin or Wotan, recognizing similarities in their roles as wanderers, magic users, and guides of the dead. This interpretatio Romana, the Roman practice of identifying foreign gods with Roman ones, led to numerous hybrid Mercury figures throughout Europe. In later antiquity, Hermes became associated with Hermeticism, a philosophical and religious tradition that flourished in Greco-Roman Egypt. Hermes was identified with the Egyptian god Thoth, creating the figure of Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great Hermes. This syncretic deity was credited with writing numerous texts on philosophy, magic, alchemy, and astrology. The Hermetic texts, collected as the Corpus Hermeticum, claimed to contain ancient wisdom passed down from Hermes Trismegistus. These texts influenced medieval and Renaissance thought tremendously. Alchemists, astrologers, and philosophers studied the Hermetic writings, finding in them a philosophical system that blended Greek philosophy, Egyptian mysticism, and later Christian elements. The famous phrase, "as above, so below," from the emerald tablet attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, became central to alchemical and magical thinking. The caduceus, Hermes's staff, evolved in meaning over time. In the Renaissance and early modern period, it became associated with medicine and healing, though this was technically a confusion with the rod of Asclepius, which has only one snake and belongs to the god of medicine. Despite this error, the caduceus remains a common medical symbol, particularly in the United States, appearing on ambulances, hospitals, and medical organizations. Medical professionals have long pointed out this mistake, but the symbol persists, perhaps because Hermes' qualities of speed and communication seem appropriate for emergency medical services. In psychology, Carl Jung identified Hermes as an archetypal figure representing the unconscious mind, the trickster, and the facilitator of individuation. Jung saw Hermes' role as psychopomp, as symbolizing the guiding of consciousness through the underworld of the unconscious, helping individuals integrate shadow aspects of the self. The trickster archetype, embodied by figures like Hermes, represented the force that disrupts established order, challenges assumptions, and enables psychological growth. In modern popular culture, Hermes appears frequently. He's a character in countless retellings of Greek myths, from children's books to adult novels. He appears in films, television shows, video games, and comics, usually depicted as quick-witted, charming, and somewhat morally flexible. Percy Jackson's Hermes is a busy, somewhat absent father figure who runs the Divine Postal Service. Marvel Comics' Hermes works for Olympus Corporation. Disney's Hercules features Hermes as a sort of divine social media presence, constantly updating Olympus on the latest gossip. The god's influence extends beyond explicit appearances in media. The concept of the trickster god, which Hermes helped establish, appears throughout world mythology and modern storytelling. Loki in Norse mythology, Anansi in West African folklore, Coyote in Native American traditions, all share qualities with Hermes. Modern fictional tricksters from Bugs Bunny to Loki in the Marvel films owe something to the archetype Hermes helped create. If we were to ask which ancient god remains most relevant to contemporary life, a strong argument could be made for Hermes. We live in an age defined by communication, by the instant transmission of messages across vast distances. We live in an age of constant travel, of crossing boundaries both physical and virtual. We live in an age of commerce, of transactions happening at the speed of light, of global markets where fortunes appear and vanish in moments. All of these are hermetic domains. Every time you send a text message, email, or instant message to someone across the world, you're invoking the messenger god. Every time you cross a threshold, whether walking through a door, or boarding a plane, or logging into a different digital space, you're following in his footsteps. Every time you negotiate a deal, use words to persuade, interpret a complex text, or cleverly solve a problem, you're channeling that same energy that animated the infant god who stole Apollo's cattle. The internet itself might be the most hermetic space ever created. It's all about boundaries crossed, about instant communication, about the exchange of information and goods, about identity play and trickery, about the blurring of lines between different spaces and states. Hermes would feel perfectly at home in cyberspace, zipping through networks, carrying messages, facilitating transactions, occasionally causing mischief. The trickster aspect remains relevant too. In a world of complex rules and systems, where clever navigation matters as much as raw power, where knowing how to work within and around regulations can make all the difference, we need the trickster's wisdom. Not to break laws maliciously, but to understand that rules are human constructions, that there's often more than one way to approach a problem, that creativity and cunning have their place. The entrepreneurial spirit celebrated in modern capitalism owes something to Hermes. The clever startup founder who sees opportunities others miss, who pivots quickly when circumstances change, who knows how to talk to investors and customers, who moves fast and disrupts established industries. This is very much in Hermes' tradition. Not for nothing is Mercury's name the root of words like merchant, merchandise, and mercantile. And in an age where so many people feel lost, uncertain, standing at crossroads of major life decisions, the psychopomp role speaks powerfully. We need guides. We need figures who have traveled these paths before, who can show us that transitions, even frightening ones, can be navigated. That death itself in all its forms, literal and metaphorical death, the death of relationships, careers, identities, is a boundary that can be crossed with grace. Hermes teaches us that boundaries exist to be understood and sometimes to be crossed, that communication is sacred, that words have power, that cleverness and kindness can coexist, that you can be multiple things at once, messenger and trickster, guide and thief, solemn and playful without contradiction. He teaches us that the spaces in between are just as important as the destinations. The journey matters as much as arrival. The threshold is its own place, worthy of respect and attention. The transition itself is sacred. In our fragmented modern world, where people often feel disconnected from each other and from meaning, Hermes offers a model of connection. He's the god who brings things together, who facilitates exchange and communication, who reminds us that we're all connected through these networks of relationship and transaction. He's the patron deity of globalization, in both its positive aspects of connection and cultural exchange, and its more problematic aspects of exploitation and boundary violation. Even his association with theft takes on new meanings in the digital age. What does theft mean when information can be copied infinitely? What are the ethics of intellectual property in a world where ideas spread instantaneously? These are hermetic questions about boundaries, ownership, and the nature of exchange. His speed, his mobility, his ability to be everywhere at once, these qualities define modern life. We're expected to multitask, to respond instantly, to be available always. Hermes understands this. He's been doing it for 3,000 years, but he also understands the importance of the pause, the rest between journeys, the moment of stillness before the next message arrives. And so we come to the end of our journey with Hermes tonight. From his precocious birth in that cave on Mount Cyllene to his place among the 12 Olympians, from his first theft to his eternal role as guide of souls, Hermes has remained one of mythology's most compelling figures. He is the god of motion in a static world, of words in a realm of silence, of crossing boundaries that others see as fixed. He reminds us that nothing is permanent, everything is in transition, and that transitions themselves are sacred moments worthy of attention and care. When you stand at a crossroads tomorrow, whether literal or metaphorical, remember Hermes. When you send a message, remember his winged sandals carrying divine words across impossible distances. When you negotiate, trade, or try to find the right words to persuade someone, remember his silver tongue. When you mourn, remember that he guides souls gently, treating death not as an end, but as another journey. The myths endure because they speak to something fundamental in human experience. And Hermes endures because we will always need messengers, always need guides, always need that clever friend who can help us navigate the complicated world with wit and grace. The Hermes still stand in a way, not as stone pillars along ancient roads, but as concepts, as ideals, as reminders that every journey needs protection, every boundary needs acknowledgement, every threshold needs respect. So before you go tonight, before you cross back from this mythological space into your daily life, take a moment to acknowledge the transition. You're crossing a boundary, moving from one world to another. That's Hermes' domain. And who knows? Maybe he's watching, that trickster god, smiling at all of us who still remember his stories, still invoke his name, still need what he represents. Safe travels, wherever your path leads. May Hermes guide your steps. And as always, if you enjoyed tonight's journey, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments which god or myth you'd like to explore next. Until then, dim the lights, rest easy, and remember that even in sleep, we cross boundaries between worlds. Good night.